Hey folks, what's up? Welcome to this video where we are going to learn how to test React Query. And I'm not talking about testing React Query as the library itself, but rather the implementation of how we're using React Query. So in this video, we will test essentially two things. I'll show you an example how to test getting data and setting data, including making a successful API call or an unsuccessful API call. So to get started, I'd like to ask you to install three libraries, which is Axios, React Query, and MSW. And that library allows us to mock API calls instead of having to make real API calls, which is great for our tests because let's imagine our backend, our server is offline, our test would be failing as well. So with MSW, that library, we can prevent that from happening and mock the API calls. So I will install those three libraries: npm install Axios, React Query, and MSW, and I'll get back to you once it's done. Great, so the libraries are installed, and now we want to set up React Query. So what I will do is I will wrap the children of the app component in a query client provider. Right now we do not have any children, of course, but I can, let's say put in a random p tag in here because we will add a component pretty soon. So I will say query client provider, and I'll wrap that p tag in there. And then we want to import the query client provider from React Query. So I will say import something from React Query, just like that. And now we want to create a new query client. So I'll say const query client is new query client. Let's see, is that coming from, yeah, there we go. That's coming from React Query. And I will pass that query client as a client prop, like so. So next up, we are going to configure the testing utilities. And what I'd like to ask you is to create a new folder called tests. You can name it however you want, but I'll just do tests for now. And I will call this, create a new file, and I will call it utils.jsx. Okay. And now we want to add some boilerplate code, and this is created by Dominique. He goes under the name TK Doodoo, or Dodo, I guess. Absolutely great guy. He's very active in the React Query community. He's writing a lot of awesome blog posts, and also had a great post on how to test React Query, which this video is kind of like based on. So all the credits go to him. And I'm actually going to use his repository, or at least his code in his repository, because that's a very great starting point for testing your React app. So this is the utils.tsx file, but we're using JavaScript, so that's why we named it JSX. And we'll actually copy the code right here and paste it in here. And because this is TypeScript code, we can remove some of the typings right here. So I'll actually remove this and this as well. Let's take a look. We can actually remove this too. So it seems like it's working. Okay, so I'll get back to you in a minute what's actually going on in this file. But for now, I'll just save it. And the next thing I want to set up is right here in the setup tests file. And I will just go to Dominique's repository again, and I will copy this code right here, like so, and I will save it. So what this file is essentially doing, as you can see, it set up a server, like a test server. We're using MSW, And it's also defining right here that before all tests or after all tests, it's going to kind of like initiate and close the server. So you got, like with every test, you got like a fresh server environment. Okay, so I will just close this file right here. Next up, we're going to write the components, okay, including the React query hooks. So I will create a new folder and I will call it React, or I mean, actually query hooks. There we go. And I will, well, let's say we want to fetch user. So I will call this hook use user.js. Okay, cool. So first of all, I want to make a function that's going to fetch the user. So we call this fetch user is, and we're going to take in the user ID, and we're going to say axios.get, and it's going to use JSON placeholder like we've used before, JSON placeholder dot typecode.com/users/ and then we want to pass in the user ID, and this should not be single quotes, but should have the backticks. There we go. Okay, and then we can say .then, and then we take the response, and we want to return the response.data. Awesome, so that's working. And then I actually want to export the use user function. So I would say export default function use user. Just going to take in the user ID as an argument, and then we want to return use query, and this will set the within the users the user with this user ID, and then we want to get this arrow function in here and actually fetch the user like so, and of course right there is going to then pass the user ID. Perfect. So this looks fine to me. I will save it, and now we're going to create a new component which is actually going to fetch the user. So I will make a new folder called components, and I will call this one let's call it get user.jsx, and this is called get user. Now let's actually put this in its own separate folder. So this will go into get user. Is it in there? Nope, it's not. Move. Okay, cool. Yeah, so what we want to do, we want to use that use user hook right here. So let's say const user is use user. It's not able to find it. Nope. We'll say import use user from, and it's in the, let's take a look, query hooks use user, like so. And now we can say that, or let's actually take a look at user, see if everything is working. I will open up localhost. Right here it now says random, which should not be the case. And of course we have to render that get user component here. Seems to be not working. import get user from, or actually it's right here in components, get user, get user. Great. So now when I take a look and actually bring this down, go to the network tab, I'll see that we are indeed fetching from JSON placeholder, but of course the user ID is still undefined. So usually you want to set this by probably your user object you have stored in your React app, or maybe it's even something that's triggered by an input field. But for now, I'll just say that we pass the user with ID 5. So let's take a look if that's working. Awesome, there we go. Now when I click on preview, we're actually fetching the user. So I could say, let's see, right here in return, I will say if user is error, then render, for example, could not fetch user. And if the user is successfully fetched, then we could say, well, let's just show the username, okay? So I will say right here, user dot, let's see, user dot data dot name. So this should now, yeah, there we go. It fetched successfully and it displayed the name. So now let's actually write a test for this specific component. So I will create a new file. We'll call it getuser.test.js. Cool. So let's create a test, and I will say if the user is fetched, the name is shown. And this will be an async function because we are actually going to make like a API call, right? But it will be mocked this time. And what we're going to do right here is we're going to use the render with client function, which we defined in the utils function right here. So what this is actually doing is these functions right here, they allow you to render a component with a test query client. So it's not going to make use of the query client as we defined it right here in app, but it's going to use the test query client and essentially going to render your application just like that. Okay, so what I will say const result, that will be the result of the render with client. So I will import render with client from our utils file. And right here, I want to actually pass in the component I want to render. So that will be the get user component. So let's also import that right here from get user. Or actually it's in the same library, so I can, or in the same folder. So I can actually grab it from here. There we go. So that's the first thing we need to do. And then we want to essentially await if it can find the name of the user. Okay, so I will say expect, and we will say await. And now we want to, because this takes some time, we want to use find by text. And we want to check if Chelsea is found on the page. and we want to check if that is to be in the document, just like that. And instead of saying screen.findByText, we're going to say result.findByText. So now let's actually run this test and take a look what happens. So I'll create a new terminal right here, and I'll make sure that you can see it. And I will run npm test. So let's take a look what's going to happen right here. All right, so we got a failing test. And if I scroll up right here, you will see that the MSW library gives us a warning. It says it's captured a request without a matching request handler. So what it's currently doing, it's actually fetching or making the API call to the JSON placeholder API. We want to prevent this in these types of tests. And how we can do that is exactly as it says, because it's not able to find a matching request handler. So let's actually create one. So if you go to the utils file, this is actually where your handlers are defined. So right here, you can actually make a sort of, you can actually mock the API call, and then you can define how it with kind of like what status it should respond, and also with what data properties it should respond. So because we are fetching from, actually go to the user hook, we are fetching /users and then the user ID. So if I want to intercept these requests, I can actually say, I can put this wildcard in here. So that will mean that, you know, that's essentially our domain name, you could say. And then we have our users, and then we have our user ID, and I'll also put a wildcard. So that will mean like everything after users, whether it's, you know, ID 5 or 99 or something else, that will be intercepted. And then I can actually define the response. So status code 200 is fine. And let's say the server responds with a user with the name of John Doe to make it extra clear. So I will call this John Doe. I will not pass in like all the other properties, because that, you know, wouldn't make a lot of sense for this component, since we're only displaying the name. So I will now save this. And now if I scroll down, you'll see that the test will be rerun. And what you will see that our test will still fail. But if I scroll up, you will see that the warning by the mock service worker library is gone this time. So it was actually able to intercept the API call, as you can see right here, because it actually now shows John Doe. So it has rendered John Doe, but because in our test we set Chelsea Dietrich. So what I will do is I go back to my test and I will change this to John Doe. And now you will see that our test will pass. So again, why we're doing this is to prevent that whenever our server is down or not working or functioning properly, we're still able to test our React app, assuming that we get the response we expect to get returned from the server. So now let's take a look at how we can create a test for a failed API call. So I will say test if the user fetch fails, then or actually show the error message. So this will be an async function. And Now, in order to do this, we can create a custom server response. So for that, we will need server, which is coming from our setup tests file right here. As you can see right here, we export server. So I will actually import that. So this will be server, actually like this, from setup tests, like that. So it's a server.use, and then we want to use REST, which is coming from the MSW library. And we're going to make a GET request. And I could just put a wildcard in here because it doesn't really matter. It just needs to intercept this request, right? And I will call this request response and our context. And then we return a response, right? And we can simply say that if this request would be failing, we would have a failing HTTP status, right? So I could say right here that the status is, let's say, 500, which means internal server error. And now we can do the same thing. So we can render that that get user component by using the render with client function. And then I can actually copy this because it will be quite similar. So now instead of trying to find John Doe, we want to try to find could not fetch user. And as always, it's a good idea to first let your tests fill. So I will actually call this user X. So let's take a look. And now our test should fill. At least one should pass and one should fill. There you go. But you see that the React testing library is actually able to find could not fetch user. So we were successfully able to display the error message that we initiated right here. And so I will change this to could not fetch user ... And now you will see that both of our tests will be passing. So now I showed you an example of getting data from a server. Now let's actually take a look at how we can do this for, let's say, creating a new resource on a server. So I'll just close these files right here. So let's make a new query hook. So I will go right here to query hooks. And let's call this use create user .js. Oh, it should be a file, not a folder, of course. File, there we go. Great. So first of all, let's make a function that does the call to JSON placeholder. So I will say const create user, and this is going to take in a, let's say, a user object with some properties in it, and then we'll have Axios. This will be a post request because we're going to create a new user, and I will use JSON placeholder dot typecode.com/users. And as a second argument, we're going to pass the data, which will be the user object. And then we say that then we take the response, and return the response, that data. So now I'm going to create the use create user function. So I will say export default function use create user, which is also going to take in that user object. And then I want to create a new query client. So it's a const query client is use query client. And from this function, I want to return use mutation. We take in that user object right there, and we pass it to the create user function. Like that. And then we could say on success. I think that's always a good practice to do with React Query. So what we're going to do is we're essentially going to invalidate the users, or actually update it. So I could say query client dot set query data, and it will take from the users the user with the ID that is actually being returned. So what we're doing right here might be a little hard to follow, but we are creating a new user on the well, actually by doing this call, and then we return the data from it, and we know that JSON placeholder is going to return us the essentially the new user object, including the ID that it has generated. And that's why we can use that ID since it's returned from the server. And then right here, I can say data as well. Cool. So I will save this. So now we'll create the let's say set user component. So in here, I will create a new folder. I'll call it set user. And then we have a set user.jsx file. Like that. Let's do our sanity check to see if it's actually rendering. We'll change this to set user. Perfect. So now I will see that the set user is showing. So let's go back to the component and use our use create user hook. So I will say const mutation is use create user, and then let's say we want to create a user on a button click. So I will create a button with the type of button, and I will call it mutate, or at least it will contain the text mutate. And then on click, I want to make a mutation. So I will say mutation.mutate. And right in here, I could then pass the user object. So of course, in the real scenario, we would probably have something like a form which would actually do this mutation. But to keep things simple, I will just define the user object right here. So we could have, I don't know, a guy called Mike Doe and age 50, something like that. And then we could, well, we could actually do the same thing as we did in the previous component. So we could say that if the mutation dot is error, then we want to render could not create user. And if it's successful, so if success, then we, because the server will respond with the user object, we could say mutation, mutation dot data dot name, for example. Okay. So now when I save it, we can test this. When I click on mutate, you will see we get Mike Doe, which is actually being returned from the server. As you can see, we made a post request and it responded with the age, the name, and the ID that was generated by the JSON placeholder server. Great, so that's working. So now also let's write a test for this component. So I will go to our set user folder, and I will call the set user test.js. I'll make a test, and we can say if a user is created, show the username. This will also be an async function. And here we are essentially going to do the same thing. So we'll say const result is render with client, and this is going to render the get user component, or set user component, of course. Set user, like that. I'll just import those. Oops. From utils, and import set user from set user. So now we want to add one more thing, because to actually fetch the user, we need to click this button. So I could use the testing playground for this. And if you don't know how to use this, I recommend to watch the previous videos that are part of the React testing library, where we will also be using this extension. But essentially what we're trying to do is this is helping us to target the actual thing we want to target on the screen. So I'll copy this, and I will say user event dot click, and then we have screen, which we can import from the testing library. So that looks pretty good. Let's take a look what's going wrong here. From React testing library React, there we go. And then we want to put our expect, and we want to await, and we essentially now are going to wait for MikeDo to show up. But because we're also going to intercept this API call, I will go to the utils file, and right here I will create a new endpoint, you could say. So this, instead of a get request, will be a post request. And this is kind of almost the same, except for that we are not passing anything like a user ID. So we can just leave that at like /users. And let's say the server is going to respond with a name of Chuck Norris. Cool. So I will save this, and I'll go back to the test. We want to await result dot find by text, and we want to look for Chuck Norris. Let's actually do it like this, so our test will fill to be in the document, like that. I'll save it. So let's take a look at our tests, and we should have 3 tests, of which 2 will pass and 1 will fill. But as you can see right here, we have Chuck Norris, so that seems to be working. So now if I will change it to Chuck Norris, save the file again, you will see that all the tests will be passing. There we go. And of course, also in this test, we could make a test to check if the API call is unsuccessful, that the error message is shown. But I think you get the point. But this is a great way to test your React query implementation. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.